guys, welcome to my shop. We're going to start a new project today. Come along, see how it turns out. So I'm going to try adding a couple voiceovers to my videos just to see if that can help move the video along a little bit in the parts where I'm not really talking to the camera. Currently, I'm unloading 3 4x8 sheets of plywood out of my truck. Normally, I try to have a second person give me a hand with this because these sheets can get fairly heavy, and the last thing I want to do is hurt myself or drop the wood. So what I did is I backed the truck up as close as I could to my workbench and still allowing myself room to move around, and ended up just pulling them out of the bed onto the workbench. So after we got the plywood unloaded out of the truck, I went down to the house and I generated a cut list for the project. I used a cut list optimizer. It's a pretty decent service. It's the first time I've used it. Basically, it allows you to take a look to see how many sheets of plywood you need, and we'll show you exactly where to cut, the dimensions and everything. I highly recommend using something like this. I did design it in SketchUp, so I kind of knew what it was going to roughly look like. So what I did is after I unloaded the wood, I went through and took a look at every sheet of plywood to see which one would be the best. This sheet is going to be the exterior of the cabinet. So I picked the one that had the nicest grain, that looked the best, and had the least imperfections. Next, I'm going to lay it out to see exactly where the cuts are and how I want it to go. I'm going to be breaking this down with a track saw to make it a little bit easier when I get to the table saw. The sheets are extremely heavy, so if you got 2 people, do it. I did it with 1 and it worked out, but if you can break these down with a track saw, if you have one, that would be the ideal situation. Circular saw will work as well. I would recommend using a guide with it. I was lucky enough to get a track saw for Christmas for my wife, so thank you, Fiona. So we need 7 inches. My pencil. On projects like this, where there are multiple pieces that are different sizes, a cut list is highly beneficial. Currently, I'm double checking my cut list and laying out the first cuts for this project. These pieces will be taken to the table saw later to be cut to final size, but this step will make the larger pieces much easier to handle in the future. After getting the piece marked out, I am adjusting the cut depth on my track saw to be a little deeper than the thickness of the plywood. I also have a piece of foam board underneath the plywood to prevent tear out on the plywood and to protect my workbench from the saw blade. Yeah, I got sawdust in my shoes. That's a lovely feeling. So even though the track saw was extremely useful during this project, I will need to invest into another piece of track. The current track that I'm using is about 50 inches long, so when working with full sheets of plywood, the saw needs to be relocated for the longer cuts. Because I am just breaking down the plywood, the cuts do not need to be perfect, but when relocating the track saw, it is important to try and line the cut up the best you can to avoid creating more waste. I find it helpful to label my pieces as I am cutting them to avoid any confusion. It can be easy to mix up pieces that are similar in size when doing repetitive tasks like this. What I'd like to do is take a piece of painter's tape and label the piece with a Sharpie once I'm done cutting it, and then I mark it off on my cut list so I don't double cut. Breaking down boards can be a very repetitive task, but it is important to stay focused when doing these types of tasks to avoid mistakes. And here's a great example of why. Ooh. This is why you always measure twice and cut once. Almost just blew some material. I mean, theoretically it would have made it, but it would have been a little short. So we actually need to measure 24, not 20. Now, I will admit that I did some unsafe cutting when finalizing some of my pieces on the table saw. Due to the pieces being longer than they were wide, it could have caused some major kickback on the table saw. But luckily, these pieces were small enough that I could tackle them on my miter saw, so I'm switching tools to finalize these sizes. Sorry, I gotta cut you off. Cut you off again. Breakdown of all the sheets. We first took the track saw and broke them down to a rough dimension, table saw to the final dimensions. All of these pieces here with the green labels on them are for the exact pieces that we need. These are cut down to the final size. They just need to be assembled. And out of 2 1/4 sheets of plywood, this is all the scrap that we have. Some of it is usable, pieces are not. But the cut list optimizer definitely did do a good job. I couldn't really see any pieces that could have been cut down from anything else due to the dimensions. But if that's all the scrap I have after 2 1/2 pieces of plywood, I'd say it's worth checking out. So we have all the pieces cut to final size. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the faces of the side of the cabinet to figure out which ones I want on the outside. I'm looking for grain orientation to see which one's going to look best. At that point, we're going to start using my new Kreg jig. This is the Kreg 720 Pro. Really nice piece of equipment. I haven't used it yet, but I've used Kreg in the past, and they're a very good company. So we're going to use that to put some pocket holes in to at least get the rough outline of the cabinet put together, and go from there. So before we actually start drilling holes into our good pieces of wood, I'm going to take a couple scrap pieces from the plywood that I cut earlier, just to make sure we have our depth for our Kreg jig set properly. So according to the guide that came with Kreg, the 3/4 inch material takes either 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 if it's in between. So I do have a ton of screws that I've built up over the years using Kreg. I'm going to take the board that we drilled the holes into and screw them into another scrap piece just to see which one is going to be the best one for the project, so I don't punch any holes through the other material. So I have this set up so you guys can see it a little easier, but Kreg makes this nice clamp that will go into the pocket hole and then clamp on the other side of the wood. This allows you to align the boards up and make sure that they're nice and flush before you start screwing everything in. Holds it nice and tight. So this first one that I'm going to put in is the 1 1/2. And the second one will be the 1 1/4 inch. So neither one, it looks like neither one punched through. So I'm probably going to use the 1 1/2 inch just because I have more of them. So
one of the things I really like about the Kreg jig is this vacuum attachment. It makes drilling these holes a lot nicer when you don't have to worry about cleaning up all the shavings. The Kreg jig has 3 different options for holes, but I'm drilling one hole at a time and then moving the board over to distribute the screws as evenly as possible. This will ensure that the screws have equal holding power over the length of the board. When drilling pocket holes, I like to mark out which edges are going to be receiving pocket holes to avoid making more than needed. I will normally do a dry fit prior to drilling any holes and mark with a pencil on which edges are receiving the pocket holes. This can help avoid making more work for yourself in the future because, everybody loves to do more work than necessary. Since I'm pretty sure you don't want to watch me drill 1,000 pocket holes, I finished the rest of them off camera.
So this is the other end of the cabinet. This is the base of the cabinet. There's going to be some supports underneath to make sure the customer is going to have a fairly heavy amp on the bottom. So we're going to space these off just a little bit so we can add some extra support underneath. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a couple of the spacers that I'm going to use underneath to make sure that the bottom piece is flush where it needs to be. So I'm just putting in a couple spacers here, and then we will start working on the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully open this a little bit just so I can get this piece out to allow us to get some glue on both sides.
So apparently I wanted to block the view of this step, but I'm using the pocket hole clamp again to make sure that the piece of wood is in the proper spot, and then driving in a few screws on either side to make sure it's locked in place. After the couple screws were put in on both sides, I then drove in the rest of the screws. It was fairly warm that day, so the working time of the glue was a little shorter than I was hoping, so I was worried about getting all the screws in before the glue had set up.
So I was just getting set up to put up in the back pieces. That'll add some support, and realized I made an oopsie. So these were supposed to be 50.5 inches, and for whatever reason, they're 4 inches short. So although SketchUp and cut list were great, we did make some modification, and apparently I forgot to modify these. So now I have to reset and cut some bigger pieces. It's always good to have extra material laying around. Luckily I still have about 3/4 of a sheet of plywood from the original cuts. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera. Guys, I did it! I cut the pieces! And they fit. And that's just a friction fit. So I was able to use the extra piece of plywood that I had to cut some extra pieces. So now I'm just gonna have some more scrap laying around the shop for future projects. We're gonna go ahead and work on getting pocket holes put in and get these secure. All right, so we have all the pocket holes cut, and we're gonna go ahead and glue this in. We're gonna spread a small bead of glue around, flip it over, and get it in place.
Unlike the previous times where I used the pocket hole clamp and only drove a couple screws to secure the piece of wood, I am using the clamp on every screw on this part of the project. The walls of the cabinet warped slightly while sitting, and I was using the clamp to make sure the sides and back of the cabinet were touching before driving every screw. Doing this did help make the sides of the cabinet straight again. Hey guys, I wanted to thank you for watching the video. I'm going to break this build into a couple different parts just due to the length of the video. The next video is going to work on final assembly of the cabinet and finishing. If you could please subscribe to the channel so I can keep making these videos, that would be fantastic. And if you could please like, comment, and share this video, that would be amazing. I will go ahead and wrap this up, and I'll see you guys next time.